I am so excited to have our next guest, Matthew Freeman, on the Tiffany Kobashigawa podcast. Matthew is the author of Overcoming Bias, Building Authentic Relationships Across Differences. As the founder and CEO of Dialectics Consulting, Matthew leads the organization's community engagement and facilitation strategy, working with clients to bring awareness to diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. As an international educator, Matthew connects people around the world to address and challenge seeming differences that divide us. Matthew has worked with members of Congress, the Federal Reserve System, as well as organizations of all sizes, from Fortune 500s to small nonprofits, to explore what we know about unconscious bias and what impact bias has on our human interactions. I hope you enjoy Matthew's message as much as I do. Welcome, Matthew, and thank you for being here. I have lots of questions, and I hope we can get to all of them, or at least most of them today.
Thanks, Tiffany. It is so good to be with you on your podcast. I'm excited for the conversation.
Well, so you know me. We've known each other for a little while now, and so I'm not shy about anything. Let's just go ahead and dive right in. How about that?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so this first question I have is kind of loaded and it's a little long. So what is DEIB, like the basic principles and the drivers of DEIB? And right now, why is it so controversial that Texas Governor Greg Abbott wants diversity consideration banned from the workplace? What's going on here?
So I always think of DEI, and let's bracket the B for a second, as actually fairly simple. Actually think diversity, inclusion, and equity is a better order, but that spells die, and nobody wants to use that as an acronym. So we go with DEI. And diversity simply means the mix. What's the mix of people that we have in our community, in our organization, on our board, whatever, right? So it's the property of a group, not an individual. So like I am neither diverse nor non-diverse, but a group can be diverse or not particularly diverse. So I did some work in Kenya one time. I brought diversity into every room that I walked into for the week that I was there, because as a white man, it was entirely Black folks there. So diversity is just, let's look at the mix and let's think about whether it's the kind of mix we want and we need, that reflects our community or not. Inclusion is, how is the mix working? Right? Does everybody have a voice at the table, a seat at the table, a voice at the table? Does everybody feel like their voice matters? Right? But we can put a bunch of different people together and it can go really well or it can go poorly. And that's what inclusion is really trying to get at. And equity, I would say, like when I first started doing this work 20 years ago, nobody was using that word. That is newer in this mix. And over the last 5 or 6 years, it has become another standard way for us to look at things. Equity simply invites us to look at the outcome. So what we're trying to get people to do when we ask about equity is, can you look at a person's, let's just use race for example. So if we look at racial equity, can you look at a baby who's born and the racial group that they're going to be assigned to and predict how well they're going to do in our society? Whether they'll thrive, whether they'll succeed. And what equity is inviting us to do is to look at the fact that race and sex and gender, and whether you're part of the LGBT community, predicts a lot of things about how well people succeed or not in our community, from health outcomes to income inequality to who's going to own a house or not. And equity is trying to get us to the point in society where that kind of stuff, your identities don't predict anything about your ability to succeed or thrive. And then belonging, I think, is another way for people to try to wrap all of that up into one, right? So if you work at an organization, do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like, that you matter, that people care about you? And so that, I feel like, is a nice umbrella term to try to use something less technical than equity, right? To say belonging, like most people understand and get that and want that, right? And why is it controversial? Oh, we're starting off hard hitting, aren't we?
Yeah.
So I don't personally know your governor, and I can't see what's in his heart. So, I think the easy flippant answer is, oh, well, he's just racist or, whatever. I have no idea what's motivating him. But what I can tell you, lots of surveys in the US show that plenty of white folks in this country don't think that racism is that big of a deal. And there's a lot of data that shows that probably just north of 50% of white folks in the US think that we talk too much about racism, and that we need to focus on it less. So I think since the civil rights legislation was passed in the 60s, there was affirmative action, there was a focus on multiculturalism. Now we call it, DEI. There's always been some resistance. And so what I think politicians know is that they're going to get at least half of the white vote by resisting these kinds of efforts from folks who think that we just need to move on, right? That this isn't that big of a deal.
Yeah.
I think we could get deeper into the psychology of why that is. But what I know is that politicians aren't going to suffer from making that kind of a stance. And so they'll probably get a few cheers, they'll probably get a few nods, and they'll probably get some people who just don't care enough to vote against people who take that kind of a stance. But I think part of the work that we need to do is to help people understand the way that, that race and identity still impacts people's outcomes and their ability to, again, succeed or thrive in our community. So,
Right, because at the end of the day, the numbers don't lie. And I think I had a conversation with somebody not too long ago, and they said, one of the reasons why diversity hiring practices are not maybe favorably seen by some generations within the workforce is that it looks like it's affirmative action 2.0. It's just the next step. And, affirmative action has got a bad connotation to it.
right.
And so if DEIB practices are seen as step 2 of affirmative action, then like you said, automatically you're going to have at least 50% of the folks here in Texas, where we are, that are going to agree. It's not necessary.
Right. And I think I did a project years ago for a group in Michigan, and we looked at what's the language that you can use to get people to buy into this and into an equity framework. And one of the things that we found in doing that research was the big divide is actually not which party do you vote for. It's about, do you take an individualist mindset or a communitarian mindset, where if your basic beliefs about life are, we can't rely on our neighbors, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you got to do everything yourself, right? And that kind of individualist mindset, those folks are typically pretty opposed to any interventions that are looking at equity, because that's ultimately looking at groups, right? It's looking at racial groups, it's looking at our history, it's looking at all these things that are something other than, did you work hard enough for what you get in life, versus the community oriented folks who are much more likely to say, no, where everybody, relationships is interwoven, like where we have to take care of each other because we're this interconnected network of people, and everything is intertwined. And it's people who have those mindsets who often live in cities, right, versus people who live in rural areas or suburban areas. Those are the folks who are much more open to this kind of work. And what's the cause of that? Is it ideology? Is it religion? Is it living by yourself with no neighbors for 5 miles? I don't know. Maybe it's a mix of all of that. But I think that is part of what's going on, is this kind of individual versus community mindset that philosophically underlies this kind of a difference. And so that's part of what we need to understand too. It's not as tempting as it might be for those of us who are really passionate about this to say it's good people versus bad people. There's a lot else going on here that I think it's helpful for us to understand if we believe we can persuade people to come on board to this work with us.
Right. And so I think you challenge that in understanding that it's a nuanced conversation. I think that's part of your work, is to say it's not black or white, for lack of a better concept or term. It is a nuanced conversation. So thank you for breaking that down. So can you explain conscious and unconscious bias? right? And within the framework, how do HR leaders, right, and hiring managers, since we're talking about workplace diversity and how Texas governor doesn't like that, how do they avoid recruiting with bias, right? And then can we do anything to avoid it?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the difference between conscious and unconscious bias might seem really obvious on its surface, but it's really important to try to distinguish what you're dealing with when you're doing this work. So, conscious bias is simply somebody who is bigoted and proud of it, right? Like they're not going to hide the fact that I don't want to hire these kinds of folks, or and that largely is going to run into legal challenges with the Civil Rights Act and other legal protections. So most people tend to hide that, but it is still, it's still out there. There are still a bunch of people in the world who are consciously bigoted and just own the fact that they don't like certain kinds of folks. Unconscious bias is something that is much more pernicious, difficult to identify and see. But basically, you've got people who are folks like you and me who say that we care about this. We say that we are trying to do our best, and yet, if you look at the actions of regular folks, we are still perpetuating the same kinds of biased decisions that folks who are consciously biased do. So how is that? Why is that? What do we know about why that works? Well, part of it is that just a big part of our brain operates on autopilot. We make snap judgments about people and we don't even know it. Right. So when you have a pile of resumes in front of you and you've got a deadline and you've got to look through 30 resumes and decide who the top 5 candidates are, your brain automatically uses things that are familiar to you to say, this is a good candidate and this isn't. So things like names you're familiar with versus names that might be culturally foreign, schools that are, Ivy League schools versus, say, HBCUs or something else, right? Like your brain is using that to say, oh, this is a good candidate, this is a good candidate in ways we're not even consciously aware of. And so part of what you got to do is one, slow your processes down. So all of the research shows that it's that snap judgment, like fast thinking. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, he talks a lot about the upsides of the fact that our brains can make like instant assessments of their environment.
Right.
But this is the negative version of that, right?
Right.
This is like the shadow side of that. So so what we're saying is that fast thinking part also can lead you to making decisions to favor dominant culture candidates or people you're just more familiar with. And so the slow thinking part of your brain actually is aware that these kinds of stereotypes are problematic. So slowing yourself down, slowing the process down, having more than just one person involved so that you have to have a conversation about it. Who did we choose and why? As simple as all of that is, it can be really helpful. And then there's other things like, pulling the names off resumes, or some places even pull the schools off of resumes, so that you are hiding some of those things that might be cues about, a person's culture or race that might lead your unconscious brain to decide against them or for them.
That's really, really, really interesting. I don't even know how to kind of respond to that. That's ugh, that's just so sad to me that, in a split second, and I understand everybody's busy, and I love it. I've never heard of just making processes slower to combat that. But that's really interesting.
One of the things I work with doctors on is because a lot of this research has been done in healthcare because it's literally life or death. But it's simply getting a doctor to pause, read the name of the person on their chart and read a little bit of their chart before they open the door.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever been in a doctor's office where they're like pulling the chart as they're opening the door, like they're barely making eye contact because they've got to get through so many patients and they're already
15
behind.
minutes or less, 15
right?
minutes or less.
And people are stressed and whatever. So but what they've found is if they can get the doctors to slow down and just pause for a second before they interact with the patient, they do better at not doing biased kinds of treatments because they've just taken that moment to remember this is a human being that I need to, get to know and interact with.
And I'm glad that you said that because it's seeing people's humanity, not a number, not a name, and not reduced to the school that you went to or didn't have access to go to. Also, I would think even though Governor Abbott's doing right now, it seems to me that it contradicts what we should be doing. So what you're telling me right now is a more diverse pool. And if I'm exposed to a greater amount of diversity, then I would become accustomed to it. Then I would understand, and I know people who went to, who've gone to HBCUs or who've gone to non-Ivy League schools or who have this name, this first name, this surname, this family name, who've come from these different cultures. So they're not foreign to me. I have friends, family, people that I've spoken to. So I would imagine that diversity is good at combating that, because then you've been exposed to that and it's not foreign to you.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much research out there that shows that diversity makes a group smarter, right? That if you've got people who have the basic competence for your workplace, if you put a diverse group of people up against a fairly homogenous group of people, the diverse group of people will be more innovative, more creative, because they have different backgrounds. They're bringing different life experiences. They're bringing different perspectives into the mix. And so by trying to like tamp that down, it's actually uh, it's pretty stupid, and it's also not going to help your businesses to thrive better if you're trying to outlaw people being able to do that. And so, um, yeah, I totally forgot what I was just getting ready to say. So we might need to pause for a second. And I was afraid my camera was frozen because we weren't moving, and I'm like, oh shit, did my internet go down? So all right.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. It happens. We're gonna move on, and if you want to come back, that's okay. I'll start with the next question.
Oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say. Um, so I think it's also incredibly harmful to try to stop people from embracing diversity, given the globalized nature of our world, of our economies, and the number of people who are in the workplace together. So by discouraging people from embracing that and looking at its benefits and taking it seriously, you're really harming folks who are going to have to be out there in the world, interacting with all kinds of different folks, if not in their, small Texas town, then in the globalized economy that we live in. So I think it's much smarter to say, look, diversity is an asset. We need to embrace it, and we need to empower our students, our workforce to really be able to navigate this well if we want to have that competitive edge. And putting your head in the sand and pretending like, this isn't, this is a problem, right? We don't want to, we
Yeah.
don't want to look at this.
Why focus
Um,
on it?
right.
And it contradicts for Houston specifically with Mayor Sylvester Turner. It contradicts all the work that he's been doing, traveling around the globe to make sure that he puts Houston on the map in an international way with international businesses. He's got a huge a foundation with countries like India, Japan, and it's just such a shame. But I understand politicians are going to pander to the people that will give them the votes. I understand. So, my next question is, what is the biggest mistake you think organizations make regarding DEIB?
So the biggest mistake I've seen people make is thinking that a one-off training is going to be sufficient to move your organization forward. And let me be really clear: that is not just a DEIB mistake. That is a workplace culture change mistake. So you'll see, like, at least once a year, there's an article that comes out in Harvard Business Review, or sometimes even major publications like Time, and it's like, diversity training doesn't work. Whoa, and it's when you when you read the article, it always says it doesn't work when it's the only thing that you do.
Yeah.
Right. But that's never the headline, because that doesn't encourage the clicks or the purchases or whatever they measure for success. So, and I would love to see that same article written about leadership training.
Right.
Leadership training doesn't work, right? It's like, because if you are putting all of your eggs in a training basket, and like we bring Matthew in to do an unconscious bias training, which I'm fantastic at, by the way, that's not enough if it's absent a bigger strategy, right? Like, how are we actually going to change the culture of an organization? It's not by getting people together for a 2-hour webinar, as fantastic as that might be, if you don't have the policy change or the overall strategy to back that up. So, you've got to you've got to make a commitment to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the number one reason that these things fail, according to research, is because leadership isn't sufficiently bought in. And to me, one of the big signs of that is they bring in a speaker, they do a workshop once a year, and that's the only part of this work that they're willing to do. So it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be, a commitment and a long-term goal to make this part of the way that you work.
So why do you think organizations, a lot that I've been part of, don't, even if they have lip service and they say that it is intentional and that they're focusing on it, why do you think that they're not?
Oh, that's a good question. I could turn that around on you. Why do you think that the organizations you've worked for aren't?
Oh, because they don't truly, it's performative. They don't truly care, is the short answer. They just don't have time. They don't feel like they have time. They don't invest in it. They don't see how it helps build and create community. They just don't have any true intention of putting any resources behind it. They just, at the end of the day, don't care. It's about the bottom line. And if they don't see the connection between the bottom line numbers and how a diverse workforce, like you said before, will actually help you in a business standpoint with different perspectives, seeing things different ways, then they just don't put any true commitment behind it. I'm not sure, and I don't want to say which company, because I would be lying, but I remember reading a report. Remember when the hand automatic water, hand washer,
Oh, mhm.
right? When you're restroom, the stalls or whatever. And they have the hand wash machines and they have automatic water that comes out, whatever, and the lotion. And now they've got like automatic dryers and they're all, crazy now. But when that first started, the design team that put those together, it didn't work on people of color. Did you know
Oh,
that?
interesting. I did not know that.
It didn't work. I'll have to find it and I'll share it when I do. It didn't work on people of color because the techs who were putting it together didn't test it. They did the default, right? And the
Right.
default, I'm assuming in their team was not anybody of color. And so when brown, black people, anybody with some melanin put their hand in there and it wouldn't turn on. So they had to go back and like fix that. And I would imagine that's a good example of the type of stuff that you're talking about. If you don't see, um, uh, whatever you're building, whatever you're creating, whatever you offer, whatever your products are, if you don't build those things with different perspectives, then you're missing out. What if they gone to market without ever looking at that perspective, testing that, right?
Well, right, and think about the fact that white folks globally are a minority. Like, then that product is only going to work in a very small market if you're trying to have this be global. And so that's part of my point that I was making earlier about some of the Texas policies that are harming our business's ability to compete well. Right? If you are taking this narrow view of the people in my town that I grew up around are the only folks that I need to know how to talk to or get along with or whatever, then you're missing the fact that the vast majority of the world does not live inside the United States, does not look like I do. And that's a great example of a product that would have been a massive failure and an embarrassment if it had gone to market without having that testing first. I talked one time, I did a talk for the brand center at VCU here in Richmond, Virginia, where I live, that is a really good marketing and advertising school. And they wanted me to do a talk about DEIB, and so I looked and found just so many examples of advertising failures that were really embarrassing things that had somehow made it all the way to market and had been broadcast. Like I can't remember the company, but somebody had Ashton Kutcher in brown face doing an Indian accent with brown face makeup. And this made it all the way like onto the air. So what I was telling these advertising students is, I bet if you had a more diverse creative team, you could have stopped things like this. And it was really embarrassingly easy to find a bunch of examples of things that should not have made it to air.
Right.
It's like if you had diversity on your team, somebody would have said, I don't think this one needs to go out under our name and under this brand that we're representing's name, right? And I think that's that's part of it, and that's a very public facing part of it. But we are, for better or for worse, in a very globalized economy and marketplace. And if you're trying to be competitive, not embracing diversity, not understanding how it works, why it can be a benefit, can lead you into all kinds of embarrassing messes.
Yeah. Wow. That's so. Of course, I'm gonna when we get done Google and see if I can find that. I'm just
Well,
curious at this
it's
point.
on YouTube. It's living on in infamy.
Oh, it's
So,
still there. Okay. And one thing that struck me when you were talking, I was thinking if they listened to the people, right,
oh,
who brought it to their attention.
another great example. Do you remember the Pontiac Aztec?
Yeah.
So it is
I think
your
that was
face
one
says
of the
everything.
ugliest cars in the history of cars being ugly.
So it tanked when it hit the market. Nobody bought it. And so when
Didn't
they
they
went
make a
through,
Simpsons episode about that where
oh, I don't know, I didn't see
Homer
it.
actually he actually designed a car? Like he found his dad and his dad owned a car company and he was like, anything you want, son, let's make up for all the years that I didn't know who you were and you didn't know who I was, or his long lost brother or something like that. And he
That's funny.
said, whatever he wants to do. So he designed a car for every man. And I think it was like the Aztec. I think so.
That's great. I'll have to go back and find that. But if for those of y'all who don't know the Aztec, it was the car in Breaking Bad that Walter White drove. Um, but yeah, so
Oh.
the but the when they went back and reverse engineered and tried to figure out like why did this car get all the way to market
Hmm.
without anybody saying,
Hmm.
"Hey, I'm not sure this is great." What they found was that the company culture was not in a place where people could raise their hand and say,
Hmm.
"I have reservations about this."
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, that's the like back to the what is DEIB? Diversity is the mix, right? Like you can have a fantastic mix of people of all kinds of different backgrounds, racially, educationally, geographically, right? But if you don't have the inclusion where people can say, hey, I have some reservations about this thing that we're working on,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what the mix is, right?
Yeah.
So all these folks were like, I don't think this is a great car, but
Yeah.
they felt like I can't say that because then I'll
I'm
get in
not losing
trouble.
my job.
Right. And so that's the other side of this whole coin, right?
Yeah.
Is you got to do both. You've got to have the representation, and you've got to have the culture where people can actually say, I have a different idea or I have a, critique or whatever. Because without that,
Yeah.
you
Without
just
fear of retribution.
gotta, well, to date myself, you've got a United Colors of Benetton ad of smiling faces that look different and don't mean anything.
Yeah, that's okay. United Colors of Benetton, Esprit, all those things are making a comeback between Stranger Things, showing all the stuff in the mall, and then now The Last of Us showed a
Oh, I
huge
haven't watched The
mall.
Last of Us yet, but yes, I
Yeah,
do appreciate
so
the
good, and it had like
the
Esprit.
nostalgia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love it. I love it. Okay, so I want to jump around a little bit because this is something that I really, really want to get to, and I want to make sure that I leave time. So let me make sure I phrase this correctly. I see a lot of people leading DEIB programs and initiatives who are not seemingly diverse, right? Like you talked about. It depends on context, right? Where I'm
Sure.
going. So, in fact, they seem to fit like an old guard, like a default of how it used to be in the workplace and who was the supervisor and that kind of thing. So, you go in and you're a DEIB expert. But admittedly, most people around the world, when you walk into places, don't necessarily look like you. Why are you uniquely, or are you? But why are you uniquely, I guess, credible, right, to be having this conversation in the workplace when you go and do these working sessions across the world?
Sure. So, couple things. One, more often than not, I don't do this work alone. I try to do this work with partners and with colleagues who look different than me, and who have different lived experiences. And so I think a big part of it is modeling that we can, in fact, work well across differences. So, here's us doing that. So I walk into the room um, with my colleague Ebony, who's a Black woman, or my colleague David, who's a Black man and a little bit older than me, and we're modeling generational, race, gender differences as part of our team, and so I think that is important. But it's also, I think, important for us to recognize, particularly in the United States or in Europe. I do a fair amount of work in the UK as well, that um, the white majority can do this work. I think too often people are uh, say like, oh well, you're white, therefore you can't understand, you can't do this, you can't get it. And it is very true that my identities that I was born with that were not my choice do give me blind spots and do give me areas of experience that I will never have. But if we really believe that this is skill based work, that this is work that everybody can actually learn something about doing, and also learn what your limits are, right? Learn that you have these blind spots and what to do about that, then I think it's really important for us to make sure that there are white folks who are um, part of this work. So if we are trying to create a more inclusive community, we can't expect people of color to be the ones who are undoing their own oppression all the time, right? There is a role for the folks who have benefited from the legacy of the oppression to be part of the process of building undoing that and building the new society, right? And so I think the role for me is to try to model, hey, like there's a role for you. You don't have to just step back and disappear yourself from this work in order as a white person. In fact, that's
not just not disappear yourself, but you actually have an obligation to I would feel insert yourself in specific ways. And we've had a conversation before, and you have a very unique perspective on how and why you can walk into a room and have a conversation with certain people more than I could. Could you share that with me?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I do think that when I walk into the room, there are some people that are going to be more comfortable that I'm leading a conversation on DEI, and there's going to be some people who are probably less comfortable, and that's again why I think the partnership works, because then we can walk in, and some people are going to be relaxed when they see me, and some people are going to be on edge. And then if you and I walked in together, there'd be other people who'd be relaxed because you're involved in the conversation, and other people who might be a little bit on edge because they're like, oh, is she the angry Black woman who
Love that
and
trope, by the way.
I know you do. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, and people have that, they have, I think that's part of this work. If you're going to be active in doing it, is recognizing your identities aren't neutral. You can't walk into a space and not be aware of the ways in which you're going to be perceived, rightly or wrongly. So when I walk in the room, there's some folks who, like I said, are going to be like, oh, thank God he's not going to berate us because he's one of us. Right.
Yeah.
And then there's other people who are going to see me and be like, oh God, what is this man doing? Like, what does he know about this work? Right. And the work of building trust looks different based on your own identities and the identities of the folks in the room and the whole weight of history that comes along with you. That isn't something that you or I created, but that we all live in. Right. So we got to be aware of that.
Yeah. It's very nuanced, even in our own family. So my kids are part Japanese. I'm a Black woman. There's certain conversations that we have. There's certain things the kids go, that's not your conversation to have. I'm not Asian, right?
Right.
And so I completely get that. They can benefit from all of it and can talk about it. But that's because they have a very unique experience, one that I don't have, even though I've given birth to them. All right. So I kind of want to rewind a little bit, right? So what we haven't talked about, Matthew, I know you. I know your background, but our listeners maybe don't. So how did you get started in this space? Like, what's your background? Just what makes you passionate about doing this work, and how did you get started?
Sure. So I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which was very famously, proudly the capital of the Confederacy. And so I grew up in the suburbs. They were white flight suburbs. My dad was a pastor, and the church that he was pastoring had moved out of downtown into the suburbs long before I was born. But that is the context that I grew up in the capital of the Confederacy, in a part of town where the white folks had built up to get away from Black folks after desegregation of schools happened. And so I grew up in an incredibly white environment. but with the great benefit and blessing that the next door neighbor that moved in when I was in third grade was a Black family who had a kid my age. And he became my best friend growing up. And we were each other's second families. And my family was very encouraging of that friendship and relationship. And so we were at each other's houses all the time. And I think it was impossible to grow up um, in such a white dominant environment that really venerated all of the the Confederacy and had giant statues everywhere, and have a Black best friend and not see some of the issues, some of the discrepancies, some of the disparities that happen. Right, it was just impossible to ignore. And so I went away to college, then went away to grad school, and went to the west coast of Canada for 5 years, and was living there during 9/11, and got kind of politically very activated around opposing the Iraq War. And I just kind of like and living outside the country was very different at that time. And so I would come back home to Virginia and just felt out of place, because I wasn't all enthusiastic about the shock and awe campaign of bombing Baghdad. And in fact, the day that we launched that, I was sitting next to an Iraqi refugee who was trying to get his family on the phone
Oh my
to see if they
gosh.
were still alive. Right. So then I felt like politically isolated from my own home and from the US and all of that. So fast forward, when I got kicked out of Canada because my student visa ended and I had to come home. It wasn't
They
dramatic. I didn't
kicked you
get deported.
out.
I couldn't renew my visa anymore, so I had to leave.
Okay.
I had
They didn't like march you to like a line and then kick you.
no, no, no. It was really pretty boring. I graduated and I couldn't renew my visa anymore, so I had to leave.
Yeah.
So I decided to try coming back home and wanted to get involved. Just my youthful 20s idealism, want to make the world a better place. And I was like, if I'm moving back to Richmond, I can't do anything if I can't really talk about or understand race.
Yeah.
And so because of that fundamental kind of growing up experience with a Black best friend and looking at the way that the world treated us differently, then kind of that grad school period of having your world changed and challenged, and then coming back home, I was like, well, this is the issue that I need to understand. And I really thought, honestly, it was going to be a stepping stone. Like I would do a little bit of work on race, and then I would move on to doing something else, like, I don't know, education or poverty or work or whatever. And what I found was that conversation was so rich, so complicated and nuanced, and not being had well by very many people,
Yeah.
that I got stuck, but in a good way, right? Like this is the work that I felt like I was passionate about, good at, and was necessary if we're going to make changes in society. That we can't do that in the United States. I would argue globally, but certainly in the United States, if we can't have this conversation well. So I've been doing it for 20 years now.
That's awesome. And then I would imagine that you also saw the intersection of education, right? Wealth accumulation, lack of education, lack of resources, right? All of that intersects. And the foundation of a lot of it has been lack of access
Yeah,
based on skin
exactly.
color. Yeah.
Yeah, the race is just at the heart of so much of our dysfunction in this country and so many of the problems that we had. There's a great book. Have you read The Sum of Us?
No.
SUM. It is really good, and she uses the example of public pools. That the United States used to have like more public pools than maybe anywhere else in the world, but we certainly had a ton of them.
Hmm.
And after desegregation happened and it was illegal to have segregated pools, most communities around the country just shut their pools down rather than integrate them.
Yeah.
And she uses that just as the example of, we can look at all kinds of things. We can look at public education, we can look at universal health care, and we can find over and over again, racism is a big part of the reason why we fail to make progress for everybody in the society.
Hmm.
And it hurts white folks too. Like,
Yeah.
so I called my mom after I read that book and said, did you go to public pools? And she said, we did for a while, and then they closed them and we never went swimming again.
Yeah.
Because my mom's family didn't have the money to join a private pool. And so, and while that's a small, trivial example of, recreation, the same thing kind of happens with universal health care and with
Yeah.
public transportation, or all kinds of things that we can look at other countries doing really well at. And the United States can't do it because fundamentally we don't want to help people that look different than us.
Yeah, that's so sad because it stops us from progressing because you don't want a group, so then you destroy it for everybody, for the
Everybody.
whole of everybody.
And
Um,
the only people that thrive are the people with money to buy their way out of the system.
right, which is a lot of people say, well, there's no racism, it's just classism. It's just about have and have nots. In large part, that's true, right? Because you either have the money or you don't, the maths. But at the end of the day, like, why? Right? Like, you have to ask yourself, like, the why behind it.
Right.
Um,
And I think the evidence is pretty clear when you get into if you dig into the history, that race is the heart of a lot of it.
Yeah, that's just so sad. I have no words for that. Okay, so I want to go back to how has DEIB like evolved over time, and then what do you see as some major changes in the next few years?
How has DEIB evolved over time? Sure. So, well, when I first started work on it, it was just diversity and inclusion. We didn't use the word equity. We didn't use the word belonging. And I think that there was still a focus 20 years ago on we need more representation. I think the shift that's happened, like I talked about with using the word equity, in one of your earlier questions, is that we've started really looking at outcomes. That it's not enough for us to say, oh, we have, more Black and brown people at the table, but what's the income disparity? What's the, disparities in home ownership or in health outcomes and all of that? And equity has really helped people to shift the focus to looking not just at who has access to walk into a hospital door, but how are they walking out, right?
And how are they
Um,
treated when they're there?
right. And so
Looking
we
at the granular, it seems like.
right. So I think we've gotten more sophisticated in a sense.
Hmm.
Um, and where is it going? I just had this conversation with some clients recently, and I think we're all kind of we recognize that every 5 to 10 years there's some kind of major shift that happens, partially in response to criticism of the work, and partially as our own understanding grows and evolves. So even the fact that we're using the word "be" belonging today, that's not something that everybody does, but I'm hearing more and more people use that,
Hmm.
and I think we're recognizing. Like equity can get us into this really, like you said, granular technical, like we're digging into the data and we're seeing like how are people treated differently, but we still need to be focusing on that emotional element of like feeling like you're wanted, right?
Yeah,
And that there's a deep psychological thing that, in addition to being treated well by like being given the right medication by the doctor,
right.
you also want to be seen as a human being, right? And feel like I belong in this community, I belong in this country. And I think that is an evolution that's starting to happen in this work as well.
I think that's amazing. And I didn't even think about that. Like when I walk into a place, am I welcome? Like, do you want me here in your hospital, in your
Right.
workplace? Do I fit into your culture? That's a whole nother conversation about cultural fit. We're not going to get into that. But I do want you to tell us. Um, if people want to get a hold of you or your book, and excuse me, did you write another book besides Overcoming?
Oh, yes, but it's incredibly obscure. And if you went out and found it, you'd be one of the dozen people who've read it. No, I co-authored a book with my colleague David Campt on using audience response technology to make your meetings better. So
Okay.
you'd be the 13th person to read it if you go to Amazon
Okay.
and look up "Read the
Okay.
Room for Real,"
Okay.
or you can just edit that all part out of this podcast.
Oh my God, that's hilarious. Okay, so if people want to book you for their corporate events or for a long term session because they are truly committed to doing the work, how do people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so they can go to dialecticsconsulting.com, which I hope maybe you can provide a link to, since the spelling is probably opaque. But yeah, reach out to me on my website, or Google Matthew Freeman, Overcoming Bias, and I should pop up. The book's available on Amazon. Used to be available everywhere books are sold, but it's been a couple years, so it might be harder to get. But anybody can order it for you if you prefer to avoid Amazon.
Okay. Okay, great. So before we close, in your opinion, what is the most important aspect of DEIB that we need to be aware of?
The most important aspect. I would say the most important thing is you need to do your own work. That while this is something that is this work is something that needs to be done through policies and through looking at your HR handbook and looking at your hiring procedures and all of that, that actually it's a really profound invitation for all of us to stop and understand the way in which the forces of this world have shaped us individually and shaped our ability to have empathy for people whose experiences are different than our own, and the blind spots that we have because of our own personality, family of origin, our own race, our own sex, gender, all of that, that we need to stop and do a little bit of self work if we're going to be effective at leading or connecting with other folks who have different experiences than our own. Starts with self. And if you're not willing to do that work, you're probably not going to be very effective at leading or participating on a diverse team of people who have differences that you don't understand.
Wow. So empathy is really the way. Putting yourself in other people's shoes is really the way.
I think so.
That's wonderful. That's great. That's a nice message. Okay. Again, if you'd like to book Matthew for your group or organization to come speak, come visit you, do a Zoom. He'll travel across the world for the right price. He's very great. I vouch for him. Please go to his website, and we will have the website dialecticsconsulting.com, or is it just dialectics.com?
Consulting.
Okay, that's what I thought. We'll have the exact spelling up there for you to see. And oh my goodness, I just want to say thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah.
And look forward to seeing what else you're doing with this podcast. It's exciting.
I love that. This has been an episode of the Tiffany Kobashigawa podcast. We hope we shared information that you find helpful to increasing your individual overall health and wellness and the health and wellness of those within your community. Thank you.